Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Genoa City was buzzing with whispers and apprehension as the fate of Nick's rearmost health dread gurgled through the lives of everyone connected to him. And yet no bone, not indeed his closest abettors, had the faintest idea that what they had assumed was a medical mishap was in fact the result of an advised act of sabotage that would shake the veritably foundations of trust, fidelity, and love in ways no bone could have anticipated. Sienna, whose motives had always oscillated between preoccupation, tone interest, and a crooked sense of protection, had still orchestrated a plan so minatory that indeed the most seasoned schemers in Genoa City might have broke before trying it, precisely switching the veritably capsules that Nick reckoned upon to stabilize his condition with bones, laced with substances that would not only destabilize him physically but also cloud his judgment and feelings, creating a reliance that felt like an insidious trap, one that she could manipulate at will. And as she executed her plan with the perfection of someone who had studied every routine, every drugstore commerce, every croaker visit, it came clear that her understanding of Nick's vulnerabilities went beyond bare-faced knowledge, reaching deep into the subtle patterns of his diurnal life, the moments of stress that made him susceptible, the times he'd be alone, the nights when he'd reach for a bottle without an alternate study, ignorant that the veritably source of his supposed relief had been corrupted by the hands of someone he'd formerly trusted or maybe no way truly understood. And as Nick's jest began to shift, first gradually and also with adding intensity, those around him, Victoria, who had been lifelessly attentive to his well-being, Jill, who oscillated between stopgap and fear, and indeed Phyllis, whose own complicated history with Nick made her instincts sharper than utmost, started to notice signs that commodity was terribly amiss: unexplained fatigue, unforeseen bursts of perversity, and the subtle but unmistakable earthquake in his hands when he tried to perform indeed the simplest tasks. And yet despite their reservations, none could identify the root cause, attributing it rather to stress, overwork, or the residual goods of one's treatments, until a series of chance discoveries, a mislabeled tradition, a rushed drugstore error, and a hopeless journal entry Nick had kept for his own records unveiled the horrifying verity that what had been assumed to be his struggle with drug was in fact a deliberate act of malignancy, and the disclosure shattered not only Nick's sense of security but also the fragile equilibrium of trust that had allowed his musketeers and family to feel, indeed compactly, that life could live without constant swings of treason and dishonesty. And as the weight of Sienna's conduct began to press upon him, Nick was forced to defy feelings he'd long buried: wrathfulness, unbelief, and the heartbreaking consummation that someone he'd formerly allowed close to his life had chosen to weaponize closeness against him, exploiting knowledge of his vulnerabilities to assert control, to manipulate issues, and to ensure that he'd be forced into a corner where every decision was shadowed by query and fear. And the ripple goods of her sabotage extended far beyond Nick himself, reaching into the dynamics of the Newman family, where Victor's defensive instincts disaccorded with his fear of farther destabilizing his son, and Sharon, whose empathy for Nick made her particularly sensitive to the changes in his address, plotted to attune her desire to support him with the horrifying study that Sienna's hindrance hadn't been an evanescent lapse in judgment but a strictly planned treason. And as the pressure mounted, the megacity itself sounded to palpitate with the weight of impending battle, the brewing questions of motive, consequence, and justice hanging over every commerce, every rumored discussion, every regard laden with dubitation. And indeed, as some sought to defy Sienna directly, others bothered that doing so might provoke farther detriment to Nick, and so strategies were batted in hushed tones, alliances formed in response to the ever-shifting geography of peril, and Nick, caught between his own recovery, the need to cover himself, and the imperative to uncover the full compass of the treason, set up himself on a path where each step was fraught with threat. And yet, amid the fear and query, sparks of determination burned within him, a resoluteness to reclaim agency over his life, to strike the web of dishonesty, to expose the verity, and eventually to ensure that those who sought to manipulate and harm him would not succeed. Indeed, as the emotional scars left by Sienna's conduct hovered to loiter, complicating connections, undermining trust, and challenging the veritably foundation of the community that had always flattered itself on adaptability, fidelity, and the capability to ride storms. And as each new disclosure came to light, emails, hidden dispatches, subtle manipulations, and the meticulous reconstruction of timelines, the pressure escalated to a fever pitch, the characters caught in an involved cotillion of dubitation. Fear, battle, and in some cases reticent remission, with the specter of Nick's dependence and Sienna's business brewing over every decision, every discussion, every attempt at normality, forcing them to grapple not only with the immediate consequences of the sabotage but also with deeper questions about mortal nature, the fragility of trust, the capacity for deception, and the enduring power of adaptability. And as the climax approached, with competitions ineluctable and exposures ready to explode into the public sphere, the question that visited everyone, from Nick to his family to Sienna herself, came whether justice, redemption, and conciliation could attend with the unrecoverable damage done, whether Nick could reclaim his life, whether Sienna's motives were ever truly understood or forgiven, and whether Genoa City itself would recover from the seismic shockwaves unleashed by one woman's determination to manipulate fate through commodity as putatively inoffensive and yet eventually ruinous as a simple bottle of capsules. The fate of the lozenge sabotage began to unfold with an atrocity that sounded nearly cinematic in its perfection, as Nick's body and mind wavered under the influence of substances he believed were keeping him safe, and with every fleeting hour, the ripple goods boosted, spreading through the Newman family, their abettors, and indeed those who had only a passing connection to Genoa City, as subtle cues half-formed rulings, ganders heavy with implied concern, rumored phone calls behind unrestricted doors, revealed that everyone was beginning to sense the graveness of what had been done, yet no bone completely grasped the depth of Sienna's manipulation, her careful planning, or the cerebral torment she had foisted. And while Nick plotted with the physical symptoms, ranging from dizziness to wakefulness to the unforeseen, jarring swells of anxiety and depression, the emotional risk was inversely ruinous, and as Victoria watched him fluctuate through a morning meeting at Newman Enterprises, her mind contended through every possible script, every lapse, every hassle, trying desperately to pinpoint how a man so scrupulous, so disciplined, could have been entangled so fully, and the irony of it eroded at her. How someone as resourceful as Nick, a man who had faced blackmail, commercial warfare, and family backstabbings, could have fallen victim not to an external adversary, but to someone who had formerly insinuated herself into his life with the guise of care, concern, and a participated history. And meanwhile, Sienna moved in the murk, precisely calibrating her influence, offering help that was laced with manipulation, sweet gestures that contained subtle pitfalls, and moments of attention that sounded nearly nurturing yet were designed to support reliance, to make Nick question his own mind, to make those around him question their capability to cover him. And as the days passed, small incidents began to accumulate: missed movables, unexplained perversity, exchanges that ended suddenly with confusion and frustration, and the consummation that Nick's situation was simply accidental began to dawn sluggishly and sorrowfully on those closest to him, creating a pressure that thickened the air, making every regard charged with dubitation, every word laden with fear, and every action potentially consequential in ways that none of them could yet prognosticate. And as the pieces of the mystification started to fall into place, a drugstore damage that didn't match the tradition, a careless regard by a nanny who didn't realize the significance of a switched lozenge bottle, a faint smell of chemicals that shouldn't have been there, the full picture began to crop, and the horror of Sienna's premeditated atrocity came inarguable, and indeed as shock converted into outrage, the question of motive impended larger than ever, demanding attention, and forcing Nick, Victoria, Phyllis, Jill, Sharon, and indeed Victor himself to defy uncomfortable trueness about the people they allowed. They knew the nature of trust and the capacity for treason to be both subtle and ruinous, and in quiet moments, when Nick sat alone in his study, the counteraccusations counted on him with suffocating intensity. Every symptom he'd endured, every lapse in judgment, every unforeseen mood swing, now traced back to Sienna's deliberate hindrance, and he was forced to consider the ways in which his reliance on others, his own vulnerabilities, and the mortal tendency to trust could be weaponized. And as he grappled with these consummations, the megacity outside continued its grim meter, ignorant of the private storm brewing in the Newman menage, a storm that hovered not only to destroy the fragile fabric of one man's life but to ripple outward, reshaping connections, reports, and alliances in ways that couldn't fluently be undone. And as Nick's wrathfulness began to poach beneath the face, mingling with fear, confusion, and unbelief, he set up that his capacity for tolerance was tested daily, and the formerly stable routines of his life, the structured meetings, the late-night boardroom strategizing, the private moments with Victoria and his children, came arenas of pressure, where indeed the simplest relations could spark conflict, query, or a painful memorial of the manipulation he'd endured. And while he sought to maintain a semblance of normality for the sake of his family and his company, the turnabout of Sienna's sabotage made every commerce fraught with implicit peril, and the megacity itself, a character in its own right, sounded to respond to the extremity with a Jack's sense of drama, as rumors began to circulate among workers, musketeers, and distant familiarity, whispers that could fluently be missed, amplified, and weaponized in a way that imaged Sienna's own tactics. And as the web of conspiracy expanded, each character's own provocations and precariousness were laid bare, revealing the subtle ways in which mortal nature intersects with occasion, threat, and the desire for control. And in those rare quiet moments, Nick reflected not only on his own vulnerability but on the systemic fragility that allowed someone like Sienna to manipulate events so completely, and he realized that the battle ahead wasn't simply about capsules, manipulation, or vengeance, but about reclaiming autonomy, asserting agency, and rebuilding trust in a world that had proven surprisingly able of treason. And as he began to formulate a plan to defy Sienna, to expose her conduct, and to secure his own life and the safety of those he loved, the megacity's constant hum came a background to the unfolding drama, and each step he took, through the corridors of Newman Enterprises, the quiet thoroughfares of Genoa City, the intimate spaces of his home, was charged with pressure, expectation, and the knowledge that Sienna's influence could manifest in the most unanticipated ways. And as competitions impended, alliances shifted, old injuries were restarted, and secrets preliminarily hidden from view came to light, the complexity of mortal connections, the depth of manipulation, and the enduring power of adaptability were each tested, and the narrative of Nick's struggle came exemplification of the larger dynamics at play in Genoa City, where ambition, desire, fear, and love intertwined to produce a shade of drama so intricate and compelling that no bystander could prognosticate the outgrowth. And yet, within the chaos, there remained the possibility of redemption, conciliation, and justice, if only those involved could navigate the maze of emotion, deception, and moral nebulosity that Sienna had so precisely constructed. And as Nick prepared to defy her directly, to reclaim control, and to begin the meticulous process of recovery, physically, emotionally, and socially, the stakes couldn't have been advanced, and the pressure, as palpable as it was unnoticeable, hung over every decision, every movement, and every exchange, a constant memorial that in Genoa City, nothing was ever simple, nothing could be taken for granted, and indeed acts of apparent care could conceal motives far darker and further insidious than anyone could imagine. As Nick's world teetered on the edge of chaos, the graveness of Sienna's conduct came insolvable to ignore, each day revealing new layers of manipulation that had been precisely finagled to destabilize him, and with every earthquake in his hand, every transitory moment of disorientation, the people around him were forced to defy the uncomfortable reality that someone had designedly weaponized the veritably tools meant to save his health. And while Nick scuffled with the treason, his family, who had long been a source of strength and stability, began to fracture under the pressure, Victoria oscillating between fierce protectiveness and the eating fear that she had failed to descry the trouble sooner, Jill trying to marshal her times of experience in extremity operation yet feeling the weight of guilt for not anticipating the sabotage, and Phyllis, whose complicated history with Nick made her contemporaneously protective and accusatory, floundering with the knowledge that her own setbacks in judgment may have allowed Sienna closer access than was prudent, and the broader world of Genoa City, always brimming with conspiracy and pressure, sounded to respond in kind, as rumors, imputations, and half-trueness began to circulate through corridors of power, the whispers amplifying paranoia, and as Nick's physical symptoms boosted, occurrences of disorientation, fatigue, and changeable mood swings, those around him were forced into high-alert countries, constantly assessing, recalibrating, and trying to alleviate the fallout, yet no bone could prognosticate the precise compass of the dislocation, nor could they anticipate Sienna's coming move, for she remained a phantom presence in their lives, orchestrating chaos with slyness, perfection, and a nearly preternatural understanding of the vulnerabilities she had targeted. And as the pressure escalated, Nick set up himself questioning everything he'd taken for granted: the fidelity of his musketeers, the trustability of his closest family members, indeed the security of his own home. And with each passing day, the cerebral risk compounded, leaving him both cautious and determined, angry yet regular, and as he colluded a path forward, he honored that defying Sienna directly would not only be dangerous but could also escalate the situation to situations none of them could control, and yet the imperative to act to reclaim autonomy, and to help farther damage was necessary, and in the midst of this fermentation, other connections in Genoa City were strained to their breaking points as individualities were forced to reassess their alliances, weigh the credibility of those around them, and defy uncomfortable trueness about the lengths people would go to achieve control or vengeance. And as Nick navigated this maze of manipulation, he was sorrowfully apprehensive that every choice carried profound consequences, and that in a megacity where ambition, fear, desire, and love were constantly in flux, the wrong step could have ruinous, unrecoverable impacts. And amid this whirlpool of emotion and strategy, Sienna herself remained enigmatic, her provocations oscillating between preoccupation, revenge, and a crooked sense of care. And while some saw her conduct as calculated atrocity, others wondered if there was a part of her that authentically believed she was securing Nick, and this nebulosity added a fresh subcast of complexity to the formerly unpredictable situation, forcing everyone involved to grapple not only with the immediate consequences of the sabotage but with deeper questions about morality, fidelity, and the capacity for mortal deception. And as the days turned into weeks, the megacity watched in silent suspension, ignorant of the intricate pushes and covert competitions unfolding behind unrestricted doors, and as Nick began to recover some semblance of clarity, he strictly reconstructed the chain of events, relating each occasion Sienna had exploited, each moment of oversight, and each case in which trust had been weaponized against him, and with this understanding came a renewed determination to act decisively, to reclaim control of his life, and to ensure that the consequences for Sienna's manipulation were commensurable with the graveness of her conduct. And as he formulated his plan, his studies extended beyond bare retaliation, encompassing the protection of his family, the restoration of his own credibility, and the establishment of safeguards to help such a treason from being again. And while the moral and emotional complexity of defying someone who had formerly been close was dispiriting, Nick's resoluteness solidified, and the path forward, though fraught with pitfall, came a roadmap of strategic, advised action, guided by principle, fidelity, and the unyielding drive to restore equilibrium. And as the battle approached, the emotional and cerebral pressure reached a top, each hassle, each decision, each disclosure charged with weight and consequence, and the drama that had begun with a simple act of lozenge sabotage expanded to touch every corner of the Newman family's lives, their musketeers, their abettors, and indeed the broader community of Genoa City, revealing the fragile interconnections, the vulnerabilities, and the profound impact of trust both recognized and violated. And in this gauntlet of mortal emotion, the true test surfaced. Not simply who would prevail, but whether connections could survive, whether trust could be rebuilt, and whether justice in all its forms could attend with the deep scars left by treason. And as Nick prepared for the ineluctable battle, the air in Genoa City was charged with expectation, pressure, and the silent acknowledgement that lives, reports, and the delicate fabric of family and fellowship would no way be the same. And as the moment of reckoning drew near, each character was forced to defy their own fears, their own conspiracy, and their own capacity for adaptability. And in this confluence of ambition, deception, fidelity, and love, the stage was set for a climax of emotional intensity, moral complexity, and dramatic consequence that would leave no individual untouched, no relationship untested, and no secret undisclosed. And in this whirlpool, the question dallied above every action, every regard, and every rumored word: would justice prevail? Could trust be restored? And what would it truly bring to survive the precisely constructed chaos that Sienna had unleashed with nothing further than a vial of poisoned occasion, a calculated manipulation, and an intimate knowledge of the man she sought to control? And as the narrative wound its inexorable path toward battle, the characters set up themselves trapped in a delicate balance between caution and courage, fear and determination, dubitation and stopgap, and every decision, every disclosure, and every act of defiance carried with it the weight of consequences that extended far beyond the immediate, reshaping the social, emotional, and moral geography of Genoa City. And as the storm of events boosted, the enduring themes of treason, redemption, adaptability, and the intricate cotillion of mortal emotion came ever more apparent, revealing both the fragility and the strength essential in each existent, and pressing in stark relief, the extraordinary lengths to which one person's conduct could resonate through the lives of innumerous others, leaving an endless imprint on the megacity, the community, and the integrated fates of all those caught in the inexorable web of deception, manipulation, and the pursuit of control. And as Nick eventually brazened Sienna, every hidden motive, every subtle manipulation, and every precisely orchestrated action came to light, and the emotional, cerebral, and moral confines of the battle revealed not just the extent of her sabotage but also the adaptability, intelligence, and unyielding will of a man determined to reclaim his life, restore trust, and ensure that those who sought to manipulate and harm him could no way again apply the power they had so dangerously exercised. And in the fate of the battle, as the megacity sluggishly absorbed the shockwaves of disclosure, each character was left to reckon with the consequences, the choices they had made, and the moping query of mortal fidelity. And while some injuries could be healed with time, understanding, and remission, others remained unforgettable scars, endless monuments of the fragility of trust and the extraordinary impact of calculated deception. And in this intricate shade of mortal emotion, ambition, and consequence, the story of Nick, Sienna, and the Newman family came a pictorial illustration of the enduring struggle between vulnerability and adaptability, treason and redemption, fear and courage, and eventually, the implacable hunt to assert control over one's own fortune in the face of the most insidious manipulation.